Welcome to the second in a series of community talks sponsored by Bethlehem Tomorrow, a citizens action group focused on the protection of open spaces such as farms, forests, and parks, and on the promotion of environmentally sustainable activities. Our community talk series features speakers with expertise on various ways we can make our lives and our community more sustainable. Last month, our speaker addressed the use of electric vehicle fleets by municipalities and school districts. Next month's talk will be about growth patterns in the capital region and Bethlehem. More information about the community talk series and recordings of the talks can be found on our Facebook page, Bethlehem Tomorrow. And please join our email list to receive updates and announcements. Spring is a perfect time to talk about composting, and I welcome neighbors and residents of neighboring communities who have joined us this evening. If there are any town officials or distinguished members of our community, we welcome you too. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and we welcome your participation. At the conclusion of the talk, there may be time for your questions, which you can post on the chat section on Zoom. Before we begin, I want to thank Christian Greco of Prescott College, who is administering Zoom, and who will now take a quick poll from the audience. Christian?
Thank you so much, Carol. Appreciate that. I want to bring up a poll. That's a two-question, and you're anonymous, so we won't know who's answering how. And there's two questions. Carol and Patty, can you see it on your screen?
No.
No, everything just disappeared, Christian.
How about now?
There we go.
Yeah.
Now
right, so there's two questions. The first is, do you currently compost food scraps at home and or have food scraps picked up by a service for composting? So you can choose both 1 and 2 if you do both, or just one or the other, or if you do neither, you can let us know. The second question is, please choose one answer below for what best matches your interest in this Zoom talk: environmental sustainability or policy, learning about composting, and or how to use composting on your property, and info about Bethlehem's composting program. So I see that there's 29 folks on the Zoom talk, and we've passed the 50% voted amount. So I'll keep it up for probably another 15 or 20 seconds, almost approaching 70% of the folks online voting. All right, so we have 20 out of 28. I'll give it 10 more seconds.
Thanks for participating, everyone.
Very good. All right, so we'll bring it down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I will share the results. Hopefully that's viewable on screen. And we have what, 67% of the participants are indicating that they do food scrap composting at home. One person subscribes to a service, and 6 of the 21 who voted do neither. And it's an interesting breakout between all 3 interests, with the information about Bethlehem's composting program winning out, if you will, of 9 out of 21 folks. All right, so with that, I'll turn that poll off, and it should be off the screen, and I'll give it back to Carol.
All right. Thank you, Christian. I'm Carol Nemore, and tonight we are talking about composting, and in particular, about food waste composting. When I learned I could significantly fight climate change by composting my food scraps, I became a kitchen warrior in the fight against climate change. Whoops. Composting scraps, rather than dumping them into the trash, averts sending the organic waste to landfills, where it degrades into methane emissions, which are up to 34 times more potent than carbon dioxide. That is why reducing and composting food waste are ranked as highly effective solutions worldwide to slow climate change. And we can all do it because food waste composting can be adapted to many different lifestyles. I purchased a small machine called a food cycler that composts scraps right in the kitchen. Most people choose backyard composting. Others pay for pickup services or drop it off for farmers to use as a soil amendment. If everyone reduced and composted their food scraps, we could change the world. So tonight, I'm especially pleased to welcome Dan Lilkus-Rain on Coming Full Circle with Compost, Bethlehem's program, and why compost is crucial. Dan has served as the recycling coordinator for the town of Bethlehem since 2010. During his tenure, he has worked with community organizations and helped our town expand collection events and ongoing recycling activities, including a new food scraps composting program. This new program adds to the town of Bethlehem's leadership in the capital region and beyond on composting. In fact, Bethlehem has one of the largest and most comprehensive composting programs and facilities per capita in the state. No wonder in 2016, Dan was honored with the New York State Recycling Leadership Award, and in 2015 with an EPA Environmental Champion Award for his role in the statewide Reclothe New York, a textile recovery effort. Dan also serves as a board member of the New York State Association for Reduction, Reuse, and Recycling. Dan is hopeful for the future as we all work together on sustainability initiatives and the other challenges we face as a society. Dan?
Thank you, Carol. And thank you to everyone with Bethlehem Tomorrow for inviting me to speak tonight. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to speak about one of my favorite topics. And I apologize in advance because I'm usually very interactive when I do public speaking, and it's more difficult in this type of venue, but I will do my best to still be an engaging speaker. And I'm going to share my slideshow now so you have something to look at other than my face. Okay. So, coming full circle with Compost, our program, and why compost is crucial. Tonight, we're going to talk about the following: the what and how of compost, why compost is crucial and essential in this time of quarantine, and now more popular than ever, and the town of Bethlehem's new food scraps composting program, including some very exciting and very recent updates as of today, believe it or not. You can see a picture there of my our greenhouse with a fresh lettuce that I harvested yesterday, grown with Bethlehem's compost. What is composting or compost? There's a long definition above, but it's basically a beneficial soil amendment produced through the controlled decomposition of organic matter. The operative words there are organic matter and soil amendment and controlled decomposition. Decomposition happens to organic matter quite often, but when we're composting, we have some control in the matter, and that's really what's involved. And that control can be anything from very informal to literally throwing your food scraps out the window into a heap, to a very scientific approach that gets down to the microscopic level, and everything in between. And most of us are somewhere in between the very scientific and the very messy and informal. So a talk in this current time wouldn't be complete without acknowledging the elephant in the room. So we're just going to get that over with. Composting is considered an essential service, along with other types of waste disposal and waste reduction. It usually happens outdoors, as you can see from this picture at our compost facility. As these gentlemen are from Mohawk Hudson Land Conservancy, please continue to wear your masks when you're within several feet of other folks. But it does make social distancing easier because the composting, whether it's in your own backyard or whether you're picking up compost at our facility or something like that, it usually happens outdoors. And gardening and composting are now more popular than ever thanks to the reemergence of the Victory Garden. A lot of you are familiar with the term during World War II, when everybody had gardens in their own property or even windowsills in order to grow food to help be more self-sufficient for the war effort. Well, now we have a different war effort against COVID-19, and a lot of folks are trying to take more control of their own food supply, and all kinds of good reasons for that. It's healthier, it makes you more self-sufficient, you don't have to go to the grocery store as often, etc. So composting and gardening and related activities are very appropriate for right now. I'm going to try to not get too far into the weeds with some of this material, but I am going to talk a little bit about what compost is. It's a stable soil or humus-like material, although it's not exactly soil or humus. It's rich in organic matter and beneficial microorganisms. If it's finished compost, it's generally free of any unpleasant odors. It's easy to handle, can be stored for long periods of time, it's stable, and it's a valuable soil amendment or a potting media amendment. So whether you're potting things or plants, or whether you are actually amending garden soils outdoors, whether it's vegetable gardens, decorative flower gardens, etc., it's very valuable. What compost is not? A lot of times people think of compost as soil or mulch. Not exactly that, or manure or peat moss. While compost can be used to mulch, generally mulch is more of a strictly wood product rather than a compost product. And it's not exactly topsoil, although you can use it to make topsoil, and a lot of times folks do use our Town of Bethlehem compost to make topsoil, but you have to mix it with sand and grit and other things to make topsoil. By itself, it's not exactly topsoil. And it's not just one product. You can't say, oh yeah, give me the compost. At our Town of Bethlehem facility, for example, we have 3 different compost products and 2 different wood mulch products. And compost to one person may be very different to the type of compost that another person produces. It all has to do with what goes into it and what your process is. Why should we care? Why bother composting? Well, there are a lot of benefits of composting. First of all, it reduces the waste that would otherwise be landfilled. Because of that, it really reduces the greenhouse gas emissions, particularly methane, and prevents pollution. And it really helps build and maintain healthy soils through physical, chemical, and biological soil benefits. Here's a local statistic. It's from 2009, but we generally think it's approximately the same. It may even be more than 30%. But in 2009, based at the Albany landfill, a study found about 30%, 29.8% to be exact, what we call source separated organic waste. In other words, if they had separated this organic waste out and composted it, instead of landfilling it, 18.7% would have been food scraps, wasted food, and 11.1% would account for paper and cardboard that could be composted but not really recycled because it's too soiled and or wet. Why does composting prevent pollution by reducing greenhouse gas emissions? Well, as Carol mentioned, methane is many times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And there are various factors, figures that people throw around. But the one that I've seen recently is up to 34 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. But when organic waste is in a landfill, in the absence of oxygen, it produces methane. And you might say, oh, well, landfills have a lot of landfills, including the Albany landfill, have methane capture systems. Well, that is correct. They are not nearly as efficient at capturing the methane and beneficial reuse of that gas as composting is at sequestering the carbon instead of producing methane. For example, at least a few years ago when I heard the study, the fugitive emissions from the Albany landfill, those that escape capture only, were accounted for the single largest percentage of the city of Albany's operations for greenhouse gas emissions. So instead, the composting is going to convert that organic material into a stable soil carbon while retaining water and nutrients of the original waste matter. The result is going to be that carbon sequestration, as well as you're producing a valuable fertilizer to boot. This is a little bit of a recap, but avoiding the methane production is the biggest climate change benefit of composting by far. But compost also provides numerous other benefits which further reduce pollution. Not only the direct carbon sequestration, but indirectly through improved soil health, reduced soil loss, reduced need for fossil fuel-based fertilizers, increased water infiltration and retention, and many more. One little statistic here is that the greenhouse gas impact of composting food scraps disposed in New York State would be approximately, and this is a very rough figure based on the one I have up in the corner there for nationally. This is extrapolated to New York State, so it's very rough. It might be off by a factor of twice that, but approximately equivalent of removing at least 500,000 cars from the road. So we're talking about significant impacts here. Other benefits for composting, why should we bother? We have enhanced soil chemical properties, macro and micronutrients, availability of beneficial minerals, which is more available to plants. You're stabilizing the pH of your soil. You're converting nutrients to a more stable form, and you're reducing, as I mentioned, the fertilizer requirements. Other biological property benefits of composting. You're going to increase the activity of these beneficial microorganisms. You're going to promote root development, increase agricultural crop yields, suppress certain diseases. So therefore, you don't need to use pesticides, at least to nearly the same extent, or herbicides, and acts as a biofilter, bonding heavy metals. Compost sounds pretty magical, and honestly, it is. So here is a wonderful poster from the DEC, and I have a resource slide later, which includes a link to this poster if anybody wants to revisit it. In fact, I actually have a hard copy here that I use for my in-person compost sessions, and especially like that for smaller groups. But as you can see, I'm not going to give you the full education tonight. We don't have enough time about how to compost, but this kind of breaks it down, pun intended, into a very basic recipe, if you will. As you can see on there, making compost takes some care. Add greens, browns, water, and air. Now you might be asking, well, what are greens and browns? Greens are your food scraps and fresh weeds and fresh grass clippings. They are literally green in color sometimes, but in other cases, like your apple core, they're just nitrogen rich foods or inputs, feedstocks. Browns are literally brown in color usually. Dead leaves is the best one in my opinion, especially shredded dead leaves. If you mow them and you use a bagger and then use that for your browns. But regular dead leaves without shredding is fine too. Twigs, wood chips, straw. I honestly don't find wood chips work that well unless you really want it to take a long time to break down. I mean, an industrial scale, like at the town's compost facility, wood chips are a fine brown, a source of carbon-based source, but in the backyard, not so much. They're going to take a lot longer to break down. Old dry weeds and grass clippings. But the number one brown by far would be the dead leaves, in my opinion, and straw if you run out of them. But most people can get some from their neighbors when the town comes around. Most neighbors don't mind if you take the bag of leaves that the town was going to pick up and use it in your backyard composter instead. And the fact the town doesn't mind either, just saves us the work of picking it up and carting it. There's some other information here that I'm not going to get into right now, but the main point is that this is in the resources section. And even though it looks a little complicated, you do need to take some care, as the slogan here says, but it's not rocket science. It's really not that difficult unless you are getting very scientific with it. And that's okay too. So just to recap, you're going to need greens and browns, which we talked about, and water and air. Air, because composting is an aerobic activity. You really don't want to have an anaerobic or without oxygen situation. That's where you get your odors. If anybody has ever accidentally left some grass clippings in a barrel and they got rained on and then they sat for a few days, that odor is why we don't want things to go anaerobic. You want it to be an aerobic process. So your composters are either going to be something very aerated like that wire mesh in the picture in the last slide, or they're going to be one of the compost units that the town sells with our bulk sale now through June 1st. You can order online, townofbethlehem.org/compost. But they have slats in the side for aeration. And the water, you don't want it to be soaking, but you want it to be damp. You can use the squeeze test. If you squeeze compost and it drips down your arm, it's too wet. If it's very dry, it's too dry, and you want it to be like a damp sponge, maybe a drop or two of water at the most. But if you play around with those ratios, really are not going to have too many problems. But I'm also available as a resource to help people troubleshoot, as are the videos on the resource slide about how to. I wanted to quickly talk about backyard composting versus large scale composting. I already mentioned one difference, but the types of things you can compost is another important one. The backyard compost, you're going to want to do fruit and vegetables, grains, and your browns. You're not going to want to do meat and bones, dairy, fats, and oils. However, large-scale composting, because you have large piles that generate significant heat, and we follow protocols when we're composting at a municipal level or an industrial level to reduce any weeds, kill any weed seeds, pathogens, etc. They're very strict protocols. Basically, you have to have it over 130 degrees for a certain number of days to kill any potential stuff like that off. You're not going to want to do the meat and dairy, etc., in your backyard because you're not going to generally generate enough heat. You're not going to have a big enough pile to do that. Those are some of the big differences. And I also mentioned already the wood chips as being something that you can do pretty easily in a large scale, but not so much in the backyard. Here's some composting resources. If you go to townofbethlehem.org, I mean, you can click on this link, but you can also just go to townofbethlehem.org and then search for compost facility. It's under departments, highway department, or you can just do a search right in the search box for compost facility. And then this food scraps page is actually accessible. townofbethlehem.org/compost is a shortcut to get to that. Those are both great resources. And the NICER3, the New York State Association for Reduction, Reuse, and Recycling, which I'm a board member, is a great resource. If you go to their main page, it's just NICER3.org, and then you search for Compost Awareness Week, or you can use this direct link. That has some great resources, which I'm going to have some of which on the next slide. You can see the fact that tomorrow at 2 p.m. is a composting at home with one of my colleagues in the state, Jesse Kearns. He's going to be doing that live from 2 to 3 p.m. and it's free. So folks want to know more about composting at home, I encourage you to tune in there, and it'll probably be recorded afterwards, I hope. Something that was recorded, a wonderful Facebook Live, but it's recorded and it's on the it's on Facebook at the following site, and also on the NICER Compost Awareness Week page there, is my friend Gary Feinland, who's with the DEC, and he does a great video on troubleshooting your home compost pile for any issues you might be having, but he also really gives a good basics on how to compost. Here's some more resources. Again, this is again in the slideshow, but it's also on that NICER3 webpage. And now let's get to talking about the town of Bethlehem and our compost program and facility. Here's some great pictures of our nice long windrows, we call them, for composting, and some happy shovelers at our facility. So we have had a very comprehensive yard waste collection and composting program for over 20 years. However, we never have had food scraps in the mix until very recently. Starting a couple years ago in 2017, we started a pilot where we had some test quantities of food scraps delivered to our facility, and we conducted them tests on that. Thankfully, the lab results show that the excellent results from that. And we also started education resources for backyard composting. And I mentioned already, but I'm gonna re-mention here that until June 1st, so you've got the rest of the month of May, anybody in the region, it's open to anybody. You don't have to be a Town of Bethlehem residents, but I know a lot of the folks watching tonight are residents. You can get 50% off a wholesale price on our truckload sale of the backyard compost units, as well as rain barrels and accessories that go with the compost unit. You can see in the picture here, some folks using the Earth Machine composter. That's the one I recommend. It's a good base unit for most people. Some people do like the more expensive and a little trickier tumbler units. But especially for beginner composters or want something that's going to last for decades, I do recommend that Earth Machine, and that's why we use that model for the truckload sale. So you're saving two ways. It's about $50. I believe it's $55 total. for the composter is instead of about $100 normally retail, but you're also saving on the shipping because it's going to be distributed in person, but with safe methods. Originally, it was supposed to be distributed in early April, but our Spring Recycle Fest had to be canceled due to COVID, unfortunately. So we actually pushed back the order deadline until June 1st, and we're going to be distributing them on Saturday, July 11th at the Elm Avenue Town Park. But the more information will be sent to everybody who orders one. Here is the link for that, but you can also just Google Bethlehem Composter Sale, 3 words, and that will get you right there as well. Here is what we use for our pilot program, and also what we're going to be doing a larger version of very soon at our facility as a permanent program. It's called the ASP method, aerated static pile. Now, I mentioned you want it to be an aerobic process when you're composting. Well, this is how you get air into a pile without having to turn it. Static pile means you don't have to turn it once it's set up. And the aerated part comes from a blower motor that connects to the pipes that you see here, the perforated pipes. You can sort of see they have holes drilled in them. And it forces air up into the base of the pile, and actually only cycles on for a couple of minutes here and there every hour, just enough to keep it aerobic. And that greatly accelerates the process too. Normally it takes between 6 and 12 months to compost fully using the turned windrow method, depending on how often you turn it, how much rain you get, or if you're irrigating, etc. Well, this takes 60 to 90 days to have start to finish because of this, the efficiency of the aerated method. So we had food scraps deliveries from a private hauler for the pilot, and we are continuing now with Food Scraps 360, which is a local company doing food scraps deliveries. And as I mentioned, our test results show that we're doing, that we did very well with the compost. And now we are expanding. I'm very excited to talk more about how we're expanding our program to a permanent program. And that is thanks to really unprecedented support from our leaders. Our new highway superintendent, Mark Dorsey, has been very supportive, more than his predecessors even. Town Supervisor David Van Leuven and our board members, Joyce Becker, Maureen Cunningham, Jim Foster, and Dan Coffey have all been extremely supportive of the town's composting efforts. So I want to thank all of them. Would not be possible without their support and help. And also thanks to a grant from the DEC, 2 grants actually, for a total of $238,000 are matching grants to help the town be able to afford equipment necessary, including the pipes and blower motors, but other equipment, including a screener machine. The electricity, because our compost facility didn't have electricity and doesn't yet, but I'll get to the exciting part about that. And paving. Ideally we do the composting on a large paved pad, but we were out of room, so we're expanding that area for the food scraps area. Here is a diagram that shows, I don't know if people can see my mouse or not, but the large, mostly empty square or rectangle and towards the bottom right or middle right of the screen is our existing area where we have our windrows for yard waste, and all the area with all those smaller rectangles above that is showing our different zones where we're going to be doing the food scraps composting. That entire area above that is we're expanding, and we're doing some below the area as well for some more room for yard waste, but the food scraps area is entirely above on the map here. It's the northeast part of the property to allow for the adequate space to do the food scraps composting. Electricity is being installed next week, I hear, as of today. You can see a picture of the power pole that's already in place. Very exciting. It's a long time coming. Our design and permits were just finalized. Believe it or not, just this morning we got series of emails from the DEC approving our permits for both the yard waste and the food scraps expansion. And we're going to be breaking ground imminently on that. Within the next week or two, probably at the most, we will begin construction, the site work on that. And we, as I mentioned, we're still accepting food scraps currently in small quantities from Food Scraps 360. The reason that it's just small quantities is because we don't have our aerated static pile method, we don't have our electricity installed yet. We don't have our equipment up and running, but we're able to use the turned windrow method for small quantities of very clean, non-contaminated food scraps that we get from Food Scraps 360. If folks aren't familiar with their service, they offer a curbside pickup for not just Bethlehem, but other parts of the capital region. But at this point, we're just getting the Bethlehem residents food scraps and a couple of small businesses. We've got, so now it's on to plans and recommendations. These are our near-term plans and recommendations. Complete the compost facility construction expansion. As I mentioned, we're just about to begin. And then we'll need to test and perfect our aerated static pile system. We're going to start small, make sure that we are doing it properly before we expand with just one of our 5 zones. We're going to be building 5 different zones of those setups of the pipes and blower motors, so we can have different piles going at the same time. But we're going to start small and work our way up. And we're also then going to be accepting larger quantities of food scraps from residents as well as commercial haulers. Delmar, Hannaford, for example, other grocery stores, other larger producers, larger commercial producers are having their food scraps sent to compost facilities, and we'd like to be able to keep that local when we're ready. There's also a New York state law that goes into effect at the beginning of 2022, which is not actually that far off now, that requires all large producers, grocery stores, large restaurants, colleges, universities, et cetera, that produce 2 tons a week or more of food scraps, requires that they actually donate leftover food that's edible as where possible, and then anything that's left, the non-edible food, the wasted food, needs to be sent to a composting program or an anaerobic digester that then composts the digestate. So we're going to probably have as much food scraps to choose from as we want to in the area if all goes well. Plans and recommendations for the near term. Also, bagged compost. I'm very excited. Today was really a banner day for the compost facility. We got our DEC permit approval. We have, I found out that we're going to get our electricity installed next week, and we did a we demonstrated a bagging machine. A company brought a bagger down for us, and you're looking at a couple of the pallets of bags. For the first time in the history of the town of Bethlehem, we have bagged compost products available. This is our what I call our full circle food scraps enhanced stream compost. As I mentioned, we're only making small quantities of it right now with the food scraps we're bringing in. So we only are going to have a couple hundred bags initially available, but they're pretty reasonable. You get 3 40-pound bags for $20. You can see the bags are pretty good size. So it's $6 and some change per bag. Available with a resident punch card at our compost facility. And we're also going to be taking additional steps to keep our facility more revenue neutral. This includes more marketing and bulk compost sales to large customers, more sales of bagged, loaded, or delivered compost to residents, and perhaps less free shoveling in the future. We have a lot of overhead, a lot of costs at the facility. And so we may be taking some more steps to make it more closer to revenue neutral if possible. Any more longer term plans and recommendations? You can see Food Scraps 360 making one of the deliveries with yours truly standing there very excited in the vest. Develop food scraps drop spots. at various locations in town, probably starting with a compost facility. It's going to require some effort and probably some expense, but that's another option for folks who don't want to do backyard composting and who don't want to have the expense of paying a private hauler to do curbside pickup. But that's coming. It's not ready yet. Purchase or lease more equipment to allow greater self-sufficiency, such as a grinder instead of going out to bid and paying another company to do that, a large windrow turner, which make us more efficient, and a scale so we can weigh compost, weigh food scraps as they're coming in, et cetera, instead of just estimating cubic yardage. Construct a garage, potentially in the future, to protect our equipment. And in the longer term, we're hoping to do curbside pickup of residential food scraps by the town someday. I can't promise when that'll happen, but I'm hopeful that at some point, but we'll have to figure out how to fund that. So that's going to be a ways in the future, probably. I want to again thank our town leaders, and I also want to thank Gary Feinland and the New York State DEC for some of the materials I used in this presentation. And I guess we have some time for questions at this point. So
All right, Dan, thank you so much. That was very informative and very hopeful for the future as well as the present in terms of mitigating methane emissions by composting. So I'm just scrolling through some of the, let's see, questions to find what we could handle right now. So Tina Lieberman, who was coordinating this Capital Region Zero Waste Coalition, wanted people to know that currently there are free drop-offs for food waste at community compost sites in Albany, at the Radex Center, Albany Victory Gardens, and soon at the Tivoli Preserve. And if you want more information about those drop-off sites, you would contact Tina Lieberman, TLIEBERM1@gmail.com. But I have her email, I can get it to you. Let's see, someone wants to know, what is the cost of an aerating system?
Well, it might depend on what scale you're talking about. The small scale system that we used for our pilot program was only a few $100s. It literally uses the same blower motor that you would use for a bouncy house for a kid's party. And so you're talking a few $100s worth of pipes that you're going to drill holes in and make a little dog house to protect the blower motor. You're going to need electricity, that kind of thing. But the types of scale that we're doing at the town facility, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars for the system, hundreds of thousands of dollars for the actual overall equipment, but some of that is more expensive equipment like our screening machine that needed to be replaced in order to accomplish this. But tens of thousands of dollars for 5 zones of large scale industrial size and strength aerated static pile components, as well as the cost of installing electricity into the facility. But, you know, so it's not type of thing that most people do at home, if that's the question. But most people do it just equivalent of our turned windrow method. But honestly, I didn't really talk too much about the backyard composting turning, but you can turn with a pitchfork, or they make specialty devices. But honestly, you don't have to necessarily turn your backyard compost very often. It kind of depends on how quickly you want it to compost. But I mean, if it's going aerobic and you want to get some air in there, that's a good time to turn it. But otherwise, you can use the lasagna method and just kind of layer your greens and browns. As anytime you dump food scraps in there, you should always cover it with some of the browns, the dry leaves, etc., to reduce odors and make sure critters aren't too excited by it.
Thanks, Dan. I think I'll remember the word lasagna when I go out to my pile. I have another question from someone who, this is about composting, not about food waste composting. She wanted to know about knotweed stalks and or the roots. Can they be put into the yard waste collection? And will the compost pile get hot enough to destroy this extremely invasive knotweed?
That is a great question. We're actually looking into that at the town level right now, the different invasive species. I believe the guidance from DEC, we're going to need to look into that. If the questioner wants to email me, it's you can still see it on the screen, I guess, but it's drain, first initial last name, drain@townofbethlehem.org, or recycle@townofbethlehem.org, but the drain one is a little bit more direct for me. But I can send some more information, but I believe that the DEC's guidance on invasive species like that is actually to landfill in plastic, sometimes double plastic bags, because they're so pervasive. We haven't done any tests to see if knotweed root nodules, which I believe is the dangerous part of the knotweeds as far as spreading, whether the composting method we use fully kills them. Probably because of the heat and everything, but we don't really necessarily want to take a chance on that. So if somebody's identifying that they have knotweed, the stalks are not as dangerous, but if you're actually digging it up and you've got the root nodules, I would recommend double bagging that and disposing it, unfortunately, in the landfill. Or you can double bag it and just kill it in time on your property, but most people don't want to have bags of that sitting around for long term. But I can find a link to more information, guidance from DEC on that, and send that to anybody who wants to email me.
Thanks, Dan. There's a question about when you were developing this program about matching grants, and wanted to know what your cost, what the town's cost was, and was it difficult to pick the site and other issues with regard to setting up this new program?
Well, first of all, the site was easy to pick because it's the site we've had for 21 years. It's the town compost facility, and that, if you recall in fact, I can quickly go back to the map here. That northeast corner or top corner there, third or whatever of our compost facility was what was undeveloped and kind of an empty grassy field waiting for future expansion. So the site was pretty easy to pick, and we did engage Clough Harbor Associates, as you can see with the CHA logo there, as a consulting engineers, one of the town consulting engineering firm, to help us with the design. So, you know, the design itself was a little trickier, but the picking the site was not difficult. As far as the costs, I mentioned a $238,000 matching grants from DEC. That is actually approximately half of our total cost, because it's a 50% matching grant for our initial budget. There's some, as you can imagine, costs always go up, especially after a couple, 3 years of between the time you're beginning to plan and when you're actually having the expenses. So there are more expenses beyond that, but roughly that's about half the cost for this new system and the electricity being put in and the construction, et cetera.
How do you handle contaminants with the food scraps? For example, plastic wrap.
Well, a variety of methods. One, we try to nip them in the bud by doing education. It's one of the reasons why we don't really want to open the floodgates to drop spots quite yet, because then we need to do that as a scaled method of starting small with a pilot program and really making sure everybody's educated about what goes into the food scraps before we start accepting it. And it's another reason why we're going to start small when we do have our aerated static piles going, electricity and all the equipment hooked up, and make sure that we can deal appropriate with it. But if we're talking about food scraps from residents, it's all about education and also screening it before you, visually screening it before as it gets dumped or before you accept it, to make sure there's not plastic or other contaminants. If you're talking about commercial food scraps, then it's a question of working with a hauler to make sure that they do the education with their customers. Food Scraps 360 is a great partner because their customers are all trained very well. We never have to worry. The first few weeks we started accepting their food scraps, I was down there every time, making sure there was no contaminants. But now I just get a picture texted it every week when they drop it off, and every 2 weeks usually. And there's never any contaminants. So it's a question of working with the residents, working with the haulers, and the haulers can actually double check. You're talking about grocery stores or other large commercial customers, they can actually double check at 3 different places when they're picking up the carts that have the food scraps in them, when they're dumping them into their own containers, and then when before they tip it at the compost facility. 3 opportunities to make sure. But will some plastic still make it in? Probably. We have a screening machine that's got a 1/2-inch screen on it, so we're able to screen out most of those contaminants as well. Are folks still going to occasionally have little pieces of plastic here and there in their food scraps compost? Probably, but so far we've been able to make a very clean product, and we will do everything we can to keep it that way.
Thank you, Dan. We had one final question, if you could just briefly address it. Someone wanted to know if you had any tips for backyard composting during the winter.
Yeah, during the winter, you can still compost in the backyard, assuming you want to brave the weather. A lot of times folks might use a larger container indoors in their kitchen, so they have to go out less frequently. I recommend putting your composter somewhere not too far away from your kitchen or wherever your back door is, to make that a little easier. Make sure you have a path shoveled, and make sure you clean the snow off the top of your compost unit. It's not going to hurt anything to compost in the winter, but it's not going to be nearly as active biologically. Everything's going to kind of slow down, especially if it freezes. But you also don't have to worry about odors much in the backyard either. So I mean, you can continue to compost throughout the year. You just have to make sure that you try to make it easier on yourself as far as accessing it, and then you don't have to worry about the browns quite as much. I do recommend you're still going to want to have the brown so you have the carbon nitrogen mix, but I recommend having brown storage. You saw in that picture before of from the poster. I recommend having brown storage near your compost unit there, or bin, whatever fenced area, so that you can easily just scoop handfuls of leaves and put them in there. You can even keep your brown storage covered so it doesn't get covered with snow. So thank you for all the great questions, and I want to thank Bethlehem Tomorrow again for inviting me to be part of this, and happy International Compost Week. Last week was officially International Compost Week, so we're still celebrating throughout May.
Thank you, Dan, so much. I just wanted to thank you, Dan. We really appreciate your leadership, your expertise, and your commitment to recycling. We are grateful to you for spending time with us this evening during what we know is a very busy season for you professionally. Tonight's talk has been recorded and will be available soon on our Facebook page. Please join us on June 3rd for our next community talk on growth patterns in the Capital Region and Bethlehem. You won't want to miss that. So thank you and stay safe. And Patty, did you have something you wanted to say to the group?
I do. Thank you all very much for being here. Dan, thank you so very much for your excellent presentation tonight, and the entire community of Bethlehem, as well as Bethlehem Tomorrow, really appreciates you. And And as Carol said, everyone, sorry about the technical glitches. I'm sure we'll be smoother on our presentation number 3 on June 3rd. Carol mentioned that the screen is also was and will be shown again. We also on September 2nd have energy efficiency upgrades and retrofits in buildings. We hope we might even be back in the Bethlehem Library for that one. And on Wednesday, October 7th, New York Energy Stretch Code with Marilyn Dare will be our Bethlehem Tomorrow talk, and we'll have even more exciting, we hope, presentations scheduled, or equally exciting for November and December. We are grateful for all of the support we get, and David Van Leuven, our town supervisor, joined us this evening as well. Thank you for being here, David. Good night, everybody. Carol, thank you for being such a great moderator.
Good night, everyone.
Yeah.
Stay safe.
Good night.